There is a profound mass exodus occurring right now, a phenomenon that is surprisingly overlooked and rarely discussed in the public sphere. It's a quiet but persistent withdrawal from society by some of the most conscious, awake, and psychologically developed individuals among us. This isn't a dramatic protest or an angry rejection of the world. It's simply a disappearance. These individuals are going off the grid, deleting their social media profiles, walking away from established careers, consciously ending relationships that no longer serve their deepest truth, and deliberately choosing solitude over society. This pattern of withdrawal was not only anticipated, but considered inevitable by the renowned Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung. He gave it a specific name: the necessary withdrawal. Jung posited that as a person becomes deeply psychologically conscious, a critical threshold is crossed. Once past this point, participating in what he termed the collective unconsciousness of society becomes intensely painful. And Jung wasn't speaking metaphorically here. He meant that the experience is actually somatically and psychologically agonizing. This phenomenon is essentially the psyche's ultimate survival mechanism. When an individual awakens to a high degree of consciousness and finds themselves surrounded by an overwhelming mass of unconsciousness, withdrawal becomes a non-negotiable act of self-preservation. The message for anyone feeling this potent pull to withdraw, to simply vanish, or to leave behind their familiar life is this: Jung would argue that you are not antisocial. On the contrary, you are becoming too conscious for the collective container. This isn't a flaw in your character. It's a measure of your psychological growth. To understand why this happens, we must grasp Jung's core understanding of how society functions. In his view, society operates on a foundation of collective unconsciousness. This foundation is built on shared delusions, mass projections, and mutually agreed upon shadows. Crucially, these elements are not mere imperfections or bugs in the system. According to Jung, they are the system itself. And for this system to maintain its stability and cohesion, it requires the unconscious participation of everyone within it. The moment a person genuinely wakes up, not just intellectually grasping a concept, but achieving a deep psychological awakening, they become, in essence, a glitch in the matrix. Their sudden clarity allows them to see the shared projections that everyone else is living within. They can instantly recognize the collective shadows that the society is diligently working to avoid. They understand the unconscious games that others are perpetually playing, and this knowledge is irreversible. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. I want to pause here and emphasize a concept that extends beyond the initial Jungian framework, but dovetails perfectly with it: the difference between knowing and realizing. Intellectually, we all know that society is flawed, that people project, and that conflict exists. But the shift Jung describes is a realization that hits you in the gut. It's an epistemological break where your deepest self no longer resonates with the dominant societal frequency. It's the moment you stop just thinking about the collective unconscious and start experiencing it as a foreign, toxic environment. The world you inhabit hasn't changed, but your internal operating system has, making the old reality unlivable. This profound internal shift is what triggers the necessary withdrawal. It's a self-regulatory function, a powerful instinct that says, "This environment is hostile to the survival of my newly formed consciousness." Jung himself lived this struggle personally. As his own consciousness expanded and deepened, he found that even normal, everyday social interaction became increasingly unbearable. His difficulty wasn't rooted in arrogance or misanthropy. It was simply the profound isolation of being fully awake in a room full of people who were essentially talking in their sleep. Think about that image: a room where every conversation requires you to act against your own knowledge. to pretend you don't see the underlying psychological dynamics, to ignore the reality beneath the surface words. This brings us to the curse of consciousness. The individual becomes profoundly psychologically alone, even when they are physically surrounded by others. It's as if they are suddenly speaking a completely different language, perceiving entirely different dimensions of reality, and operating from a fundamental truth that is alien to the mainstream. The sheer effort required to bridge this gap, to constantly translate their consciousness back into the shallow terms of collective unconsciousness, becomes overwhelmingly exhausting. In essence, the awakened person's withdrawal is not a sign of hate for society. It is an act of self-loyalty, a powerful refusal to betray their own consciousness. Every single day spent engaging with unconscious society demands a constant pretense of being asleep. Every interaction requires them to actively dim their light. Every relationship may subtly ask them to be less than the whole, authentic person they have become. Eventually, the deep wisdom of the psyche intervenes, issuing a clear command: withdraw, preserve your consciousness. This is a defensive move to stop the collective unconscious from draining the psychological development that took immense effort to achieve. The mass exodus is, therefore, an evolutionary imperative, the first step in protecting a more fragile, nascent form of awareness. The mechanism of withdrawal becomes even clearer when we look at how consciousness interacts with the collective shadow. Jung discovered a profound psychological truth. As you successfully integrate your personal shadow, the darker, denied, or repressed parts of your own psyche, the collective shadow of humanity becomes almost unbearable to witness. Imagine the years of deep, often agonizing inner work it takes to face your own capacity for anger, selfishness, judgment, or even what Jung would call your personal capacity for evil. This process is called shadow work, and it's the cornerstone of psychological development. You learn to recognize and own your darkness, realizing that the things you most despise in others often reflect something you've pushed away within yourself. This integration brings immense personal power and wholeness. But then you step back into society, and what do you see? You're watching an entire society engaged in mass projection, busily denying its own darkness while simultaneously flinging it onto external scapegoats. When you, as an individual, have faced and owned your shadow, watching others project theirs onto an other becomes profoundly agonizing. This process manifests most clearly in societal conflict. The conscious person is forced to witness the endless stream of shadow projections. The other political party is evil. That group is the problem. Those people are what's wrong with the world. For the awakened individual, this doesn't look like a valid political debate or a moral conflict. It looks exactly like what Jung called a mass psychosis. It's a collective delusional state where people are aggressively externalizing their internal, unowned flaws. Jung termed this realization the burden of seeing. The awakened person sees through the surface narrative of nearly every social conflict. They recognize that wars, at their root, are often collective shadows clashing. Political divisions are essentially mass projections, and the perpetual outrage and blame that characterize modern social media is simply collective shadow material seeking targets. Once you possess this deep-level insight, participation in the social drama is not only difficult, it becomes psychologically impossible. You can't join the angry mob when you clearly see that the mob is hunting its own shadow. You can't credibly pick a side when you understand that both sides are engaging in projection. You can't participate in collective blame when you recognize it as a symptom of collective unconsciousness. The withdrawal, therefore, is not born of a sense of intellectual superiority. It's a matter of psychological necessity. One of Jung's students captured this perfectly, noting that after integrating their shadow, Their once strong political opinions melted away. They realized those opinions were, themselves, just projections. What they now saw in political debates were two groups of people violently projecting their unconscious material at each other while calling it justice or truth. Participation in this light would be tantamount to joining a mass delusion. This burden of seeing goes beyond mere intellectual detachment. It becomes a sensory, energetic experience. The awakened aren't just seeing the collective shadow, they are feeling it. Consciousness brings with it an energetic sensitivity, making the dense field of unconscious shadow projection feel like a form of psychological violence. It is not a moral judgment against others. It is a genuine, felt energetic incompatibility. Jung observed this acutely in his own life. Following his deepest period of individuation, simply being in large crowds became almost unbearable. It wasn't that he disliked people, it was that he could feel the psychological storm of unconscious material swirling, the unresolved projections, the denied repressions, the unowned shadows, all creating a dense psychological static that only he seemed fully aware of. This is why, almost without exception, awakened people disappear from social media first. Social media is essentially a non-stop 24/7 shadow projection machine. Every scroll is an assault of raw, unconscious material. Every comment section is a shadow boxing ring. For someone who has spent years integrating their own shadow, this environment is deeply toxic and energetically draining. It is like being forced to watch countless people punch themselves in the face while screaming that a stranger gave them the bruises. The conscious psyche simply cannot sustain itself in such a hostile, projector-driven landscape, and thus withdrawal becomes the only viable path to sanity and self-preservation. Furthermore, it is important to realize that the collective shadow is not a static entity. It is a dynamic, evolving force. In our current society, it is heavily influenced by rapid information technology, creating a feedback loop of polarization and instant gratification. The speed at which shadow material can be amplified and projected is unprecedented. The conscious individual experiences this amplification not just as a psychological threat, but as an overload. The older, slower world allowed the awakened to retreat to the edges of the collective and maintain a boundary, but the digital age has made those edges porous. You are constantly bombarded. Therefore, the necessity for complete, total withdrawal has intensified in the modern era, making the choice to disappear a more urgent and absolute requirement for psychological survival. The conscious person is intuitively choosing to protect their inner silence and wholeness from this relentless polarized noise. Jung's second profound insight into the spiritual exodus centers on the psychological transformation known as individuation. Once an individual has moved significantly along the path of individuation, a process of becoming a unified, whole, and authentic self, they can no longer tolerate performing their persona, and society, almost universally, demands nothing but persona performance. The persona, in Jungian terms, is the mask we wear in public, the collection of social roles, acceptable attitudes, and expected behaviors that allow us to function within the collective. Before awakening, a person can play these social games unconsciously. They can automatically smile when expected, say the right, appropriate things, and perform their designated role without deep inner conflict. This feels normal because the individual is still identified with their persona. However, once a person has touched their authentic self, that deeper foundational truth that exists beyond all masks and roles, the experience of reverting to persona performance feels like a psychological death. The conscious self recognizes the performance as inherently false. Every social situation, from the workplace to the family gathering to the social media identity, demands this performance. The executive role, the acceptable opinions, the appropriate emotions, the perfect facade. For the newly conscious person, this doesn't feel like normalcy. It feels like suffocation. Jung's own life provided a clear example of this dynamic. After his intense confrontation with the unconscious, a pivotal, transformative period in his middle years, he simply couldn't perform the role of the proper Swiss psychiatrist anymore. He could no longer pretend to agree with collective opinions that he saw right through. He found he could not maintain relationships that fundamentally required him to be false. His response was the famous withdrawal to Bollingen, his stone tower by the lake, a space where he could be authentically himself. This wasn't an antisocial act. Jung would label it pro-authentic. The individual who has awakened is not rejecting society out of anger or bitterness, but out of a deep-seated incompatibility. They have become too real for environments that require fakeness, too authentic for spaces that demand constant performance, and too whole for containers that can only accept fragmented parts of a person. The story of a successful executive, one of Jung's patients who had undergone individuation, illustrates this perfectly. She described the sheer impossibility of her situation. "I sit in board meetings and everyone's performing their executive roles, saying what executives should say, thinking what executives should think. I can't do it anymore." She realized it was like being asked to pretend to be someone she had fundamentally never been. Her authentic self had no voice in that room, only her persona did, and that persona was psychologically dead. Her departure wasn't a dramatic resignation. She quietly disappeared, transitioning out of her high-powered life over many months. She moved to a small town where her life could be about being real rather than being successful. This wasn't a failure, it was a success, the success of finding herself. This exact scenario is playing out across society today. The awakened are actively leaving careers that require perpetual persona performance. They are ending relationships that were built on the foundation of false selves. They are abandoning social circles that insist upon the wearing of masks. They are not failing at society. They are succeeding at authenticity, and that success inherently makes conventional, societal participation impossible. To elaborate on the transition, many individuals who withdraw do not immediately move to a remote cabin or a tiny town. The first stage often involves radical simplification. This might mean a conscious choice to take a job that is less prestigious but requires significantly less mask wearing, or a decision to downsize their living situation to reduce financial pressure, which often fuels the need to maintain the high-achieving persona. The focus shifts from external validation to internal resonance. They are prioritizing psychological comfort and congruence over material success and social acceptance. This move is a practical ground-level application of the necessary withdrawal. They are, in effect, creating small, immediate zones of pro-authentic living within the unconscious collective before making the final, larger leap into a fully disappeared life. This strategic, gradual retreat is less about escapism and more about resource management, protecting the fragile, nascent self from the brutal demands of the performative collective. The need to maintain an image of success, competence, or belonging is systematically dismantled piece by piece as the individual refuses to invest their energy in a false self that no longer exists. The entire dynamic of the awakened disappearing from society can be understood energetically. Jung grasped that maintaining a state of consciousness in an unconscious environment requires a tremendous amount of psychological energy. The awakened are realizing, often intuitively, that this massive energy drain is simply not sustainable. They are running an extremely inefficient psychological machine by staying in the collective. Think about the invisible yet exhausting labor the conscious person has to perform just to function in what passes for normal society. It is a constant, minute-by-minute battle on several fronts. They have to constantly filter out unconscious projections being hurled their way. They must meticulously maintain boundaries against energy vampires, people who unconsciously seek to absorb the vitality of a more integrated individual. They are perpetually forced to translate between depth and surface, trying to make their complex, authentic reality intelligible in the shallow terms of collective discourse. They must hold their frequency, the high, clear tone of consciousness, while being surrounded by the static of mass unconsciousness. Crucially, they are forced to process not just their own material, but the unconscious material everyone else is leaking. Jung called this continuous exertion psychological labor. It is the invisible work that conscious people perform just to exist in unconscious spaces. It is, quite simply, exhausting. Every single interaction becomes a high-stakes, energetic maneuver. The conscious person must consciously choose not to react to projections. They must strive not to absorb others' unconscious material. They have to actively resist being pulled into collective dramas. They must refuse to match the unconscious frequency around them. And perhaps most taxing of all, they must find ways not to betray their truth, simply to maintain an artificial social harmony. For unconscious people, this is not work at all. They are merely flowing with the collective current. But for conscious individuals, the experience is akin to swimming upstream in a tsunami of unconsciousness. The inevitable logical conclusion is that eventually you have to get out of the water or you will drown. This perpetual psychological labor has real somatic consequences. Jung noticed that his most conscious patients would often develop physical symptoms, chronic fatigue, mysterious illnesses, or deep depression. These weren't necessarily the result of personal pathology, but stemmed directly from the sheer exhaustion of maintaining consciousness in unconsciously hostile environments. The true cure, Jung found, wasn't more therapy, but a strategic withdrawal from the environments that were draining their life force. Consider the case of a teacher who, after years of inner work, developed severe chronic fatigue. All medical tests came back inconclusive, showing nothing wrong. Through analysis, she realized she was spending massive amounts of energy simply maintaining her consciousness, while surrounded all day by unconscious colleagues and students. She wasn't sick, she was energetically depleted. When she finally left teaching and moved to a cabin surrounded by nature, her energy returned within weeks. This rejuvenation wasn't just about physical rest. It was about no longer having to maintain consciousness against the constant draining pressure of collective unconsciousness. This is the deeper reason why the awakened disappear to nature, to solitude, or to small, intentional, conscious communities. It's not about escaping responsibility. It is about preserving the consciousness they have worked so hard to develop. They understand with a practical felt wisdom that consciousness is a precious and finite resource, and spending it on unconscious interactions is like pouring a rare, vital liquid into parched sand. The withdrawal is thus a radical act of psychological conservation. The modern world, with its frantic pace and relentless demands, often confuses high levels of activity with high levels of fulfillment or consciousness. The truly conscious person recognizes this as a trap. They realize that their greatest contribution to the world is not their outward doing, their career achievements, their social status, or their participation in collective noise, but their state of being. Preserving the integrity of that conscious state is the supreme priority. By withdrawing, they are essentially saying, I refuse to let the collective's lack of awareness dictate the quality or longevity of my own hard-won awareness. This quiet refusal to be consumed by the tsunami is a profound act of self-sovereignty, prioritizing inner sustainability over outer compliance. It's a strategic move to secure the foundation of their newly individuated self against systemic erosion. The core realization is that the energy spent defending consciousness in an unconscious space is energy stolen from integration and deeper development. By removing themselves from the drain, they are creating a surplus of energy that can be directed inward, fueling the next more profound phase of individuation. The retreat is not resignation. It is a rerouting of life force towards self-actualization. The entire phenomenon of conscious people disappearing from society is also an archetypal pattern that Carl Jung identified as the hermit phase. This isn't just a random choice. It's a necessary stage that every individuating person must pass through. The psyche, in its wisdom, requires this solitude to integrate what society would otherwise fragment. The hermit archetype isn't about misanthropy, hating humanity, but about psychological necessity. When you are undergoing a fundamental transformation, a deep rewiring of your entire self, you desperately need space from external influences. These influences, even well-meaning ones, will inevitably try to pull you back toward your old, comfortable patterns. Transformation is fragile. It requires silence to allow your inner voice to be heard. It demands solitude so that integration can happen without constant interference. Jung himself experienced profound hermit phases. His years spent building and living at Bullingen weren't a luxury vacation. They were a period of psychological necessity. He needed distance from the collective consciousness of his time to fully develop his individual consciousness. He required separation from the projections of others to finally understand his own depths. This is precisely what is happening to the wave of awakening people today. They aren't disappearing because they are weak, lazy, or genuinely antisocial. They are following an ancient archetypal pattern that individuation requires. The hermit phase serves specific, critical psychological functions that cannot be met within the noise of the collective. It is the time and space when the shadow integrates without the social pressure to repress it. Society only rewards the clean, functional, persona-driven parts of you. In solitude, you can embrace the messy, chaotic, and powerful parts without fear of judgment. It's also where the authentic self emerges without the constant demands of the persona. Without an audience, the mask melts away. Inner wisdom develops without the distraction of outer noise. The deep psychological transformation completes without interruption. Let's explore this archetypal movement a little more deeply by looking at the specific quality of the hermit's light. In the tarot, the hermit is often depicted holding a lantern, a single small light in the darkness. This light isn't a beacon for the collective. It's a light turned inward, illuminating the hermit's own path and own darkness. When you are in the collective, your light is often used to conform. It's bright enough to see the rules and follow the crowd. The collective expects you to use your consciousness to be a productive, predictable participant. However, the light of the individuated person must be used for radical self-examination. This radical look requires absolute quiet. If you try to do this inner work while exposed to the collective, the noise and the projections will constantly refract your light, distorting the very self-image you are trying to clarify. The retreat is literally a necessary step to stop the internal light from being externally polluted. The individual is essentially building a dark room, a psychological vacuum, so that the faint, true signal of the self can finally be heard over the deafening radio static of mass consciousness. Jung, however, emphasized a crucial point. The hermit phase is not escape, it is preparation. The awakened individual is not withdrawing to abandon society, but rather to develop something profound that society desperately needs. They are in a period of gestation, integrating deep wisdom and finding authentic truth. They are becoming what Jung metaphorically called aquarium fish, beings who have successfully adapted to depths that the rest of society cannot yet reach. A perfect example is a philosopher and analyand of Jung, who disappeared from academic life for 3 years. Everyone around him assumed he had suffered a breakdown, but he hadn't. He had experienced a breakthrough. In his solitude, he was able to integrate insights that would have been utterly impossible to achieve while he was maintaining his academic persona. When he finally returned, he brought with him genuinely revolutionary ideas. These ideas could only emerge, however, from his necessary withdrawal from the very system he would eventually help transform. The hermit phase, when viewed from the outside, looks like simple disappearance or abandonment. But in reality, it is a period of intense deepening. The awakened are not running away from the world. They are going deeper than society allows them to go. They are doing the heavy, essential psychological work that can only be done in solitude, developing a level of consciousness that might eventually benefit the collective, but only after it is fully formed and robust. This retreat is the necessary forge where the self is hardened and prepared for a more authentic and ultimately more impactful return. The great hope that Jung offers is that the disappeared don't simply stay gone forever. When they eventually return, they return fundamentally transformed and differently. Their return is not to participate in the old collective unconsciousness, which they can no longer tolerate, but to offer consciousness to those few who are genuinely ready to receive it. The awakened who disappear are essentially following the ancient pattern of the hero's journey: withdrawal, profound transformation, and a final return with gifts. But this return is not to the mainstream of society. It is a return to the margins, the edges, and the spaces where consciousness can exist without the compromise that the center demands. They become what Jung called border dwellers. They are present in the world, but not fully participating in the collective delusion. They are available to those who seek them out, but they are not absorbed or consumed by the unconscious noise. Their contribution takes new, authentic forms. They might return as artists, creating from their authentic depths. They become healers, working with individuals ready to awaken. They emerge as teachers, sharing their wisdom with small groups of seekers. They may become writers, offering maps for other disappearing souls, or guides for those just beginning their own necessary withdrawal. But there's a vital, non-negotiable caveat. They never return to the mainstream. They can't. Once you have fully individuated, you cannot de-individuate. Once consciousness has been achieved, you cannot authentically pretend to be unconscious. Once the self has been found, you cannot live from the false, dead persona. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly in his clinical practice. His patients who fully individuated rarely, if ever, returned to their previous lives. Instead, they created entirely new lives. Lives that were simpler, quieter, and profoundly more authentic. They found ways to contribute their gifts without sacrificing their hard-won consciousness. They learned the essential skill of giving without being consumed. A former therapist who disappeared for 2 years provides a powerful illustration. She returned not to a traditional practice, but only to work with a very small group of individuals who were going through a spiritual emergency, a profound psychological crisis, often triggered by an awakening. She realized she couldn't engage in general therapy anymore. She could only work with those who were experiencing exactly what she had experienced. Her practice was tiny but deeply profound. To mainstream society, she was essentially invisible, but to those awakening souls, she was a true lifeline. This sets the new model for the awakened. They disappear from the chaos of mass society, but they reappear in conscious pockets. They become pioneers, creating parallel structures and building alternatives. They offer genuine depth to those seeking it, while remaining invisible and inaccessible to those who are not yet ready or who do not care to look beyond the surface. Jung believed this whole pattern was evolution in action. Not everyone awakens at the same time. The pioneers, the conscious ones, are the ones who disappear first, create the new spaces, and then become beacons for the next wave of seekers. What looks to the collective like simple abandonment is, in fact, architecture. They are busy building the structures, the psychological and communal frameworks that will be able to support collective awakening when the collective is finally ready for it. The act of disappearance is, paradoxically, an act of supreme service, laying the groundwork for a more conscious future. Let me now synthesize Jung's complete picture of this phenomenon. The spiritual exodus of awake people is a multi-layered response to unbearable psychological pressure, not a selfish retreat. There are 4 primary drivers and a final stage of return. First, the awakened person can no longer tolerate the collective shadow that the unconscious society relentlessly projects. The moral hypocrisy, the scapegoating, and the mass delusions become physically painful to witness. Second, the individual's authentic self cannot perform the false persona that society absolutely demands for participation. The mask is dead, and to wear it again is a psychological betrayal. Third, the energy required to maintain consciousness in spaces saturated with unconsciousness becomes overwhelmingly unsustainable. The psychological labor is a constant drain that leads to burnout and illness. Fourth, they enter the necessary hermit phase, the archetypal solitude that is required for the profound transformation of individuation. Finally, they eventually return, but only to the conscious edges or margins of society, not to its unconscious centers. This entire process must be understood not as a failure, but as evolution. It is not a sign of weakness, but a profound act of wisdom. It is not abandonment, it is archetypal necessity. The awakened are simply following a pattern as old as consciousness itself. Withdraw, transform, return, transformed. Society, watching this happen, experiences it as a genuine loss. They ask, where did all the conscious people go? They wonder why the wisest voices are getting quieter and why the awakened are abandoning the collective when it arguably needs them the most. Jung's answer, however, is a reassurance. They are not abandoning the collective. They are preparing something for it. In their withdrawal, they are developing a level of consciousness that the collective is simply not ready for yet. In their disappearance, they are actively creating spaces for others to eventually disappear to. In their silence, they are gestating the words that the collective cannot yet hear but will need in the future. This is the central message for anyone feeling the intense pull to withdraw. Jung would want you to know that this is not spiritual bypassing or escapism. It is psychological necessity. Your consciousness has developed to a point where continued participation in the collective unconscious is impossible without an act of fundamental self-betrayal. The withdrawal is not antisocial, it is archetypal. You are not abandoning society. You are walking the hermit's path that every individuating person must walk. You are not weak for being unable to tolerate the pervasive unconsciousness. On the contrary, you are conscious, and consciousness requires different conditions than sleep. The greatest service you can provide right now is to let yourself disappear, not forever, but for now. Find your own Bollingen. This doesn't have to be a stone tower. It can be a psychological distance, a simple room, or a routine of radical solitude. Stop expending your consciousness on unconscious interactions. Stop performing for audiences that can't actually see you. Stop translating your profound depth into surface terms for those who are unwilling or unable to hear them. Your disappearance is not a selfish act. It is necessary. The collective needs people who have fully individuated more than it needs people who are just partially participating and constantly compromising their truth. It needs depth more than surface, authenticity more than performance, and consciousness more than empty conformity. When you finally return, if you return, you will bring back gifts that could only have been developed in disappearance. You will offer truths that could only be spoken once you stopped performing for acceptance. The spiritually awake are disappearing because that is what awakening requires. It is not permanent but necessary. It is not rooted in hatred but in a deep love for truth, consciousness, and authenticity. It is the love that makes the supreme demand: I must become whole, even if that means being alone. Jung's final counsel is disappear consciously, withdraw with purpose. Use your hermit phase for integration, not mere isolation. Remember that your disappearance is a transformative preparation. You are not just leaving the collective, you are pioneering the path where it will eventually need to go. The collective needs evolved individuals more than it needs conforming participants. To fully appreciate the depth of this withdrawal, we must examine the concept of the self in Jungian psychology, the ultimate destination of the individuating person. The self is not the ego. The ego is just the center of consciousness, a small captain on a vast ship. The self is the total unitary personality. It encompasses both the conscious and the unconscious. It is the archetype of wholeness. The withdrawal happens because the burgeoning self demands congruence. The self cannot be split. It cannot exist half-free and half-fettered by the demands of a false persona. Think of the self as a perfect geometric shape that requires a space of absolute integrity to manifest. The collective unconscious is a space of constant psychic fragmentation, where individuals are rewarded for being divided, for having a polished public face and a shadow-filled private life. The moment the self begins to assert its blueprint for wholeness, it automatically rejects the environment that insists upon fragmentation. This rejection is why the awakened feel a deep, visceral revulsion toward societal institutions built on compromise and superficiality. They look at corporate structures, political theater, and most modern churches and see systems designed to manage the fragmentation of the psyche, not to foster its wholeness. A system that rewards ambition over authenticity and obedience over inner truth is fundamentally incompatible with the self. The modern retreat often includes a powerful desire to reconnect with the elemental, the natural world. This, too, is an energetic and archetypal necessity. The noise of human society is a psychic pollutant. Nature, by contrast, is the great restorer of the soul. The cycles of the sun, the rhythm of the seasons, the quiet persistence of the forest. These are the rhythms of the deep unconscious, the very rhythms that the individuating self is trying to tune into. In nature, there is no need for persona. A tree doesn't pretend to be a bush. Nature is inherently authentic, and its immense power provides a container that can hold the new, intense, and often chaotic energy of the transforming psyche. Furthermore, the withdrawal is about resolving the great internal paradox that consciousness creates: the yearning for belonging versus the necessity of difference. The unawakened person craves belonging at all costs. They will sacrifice their truth, their clarity, and their energy to be accepted by the collective. The awakened person, however, realizes that the price of collective belonging is the death of the authentic self. The withdrawal is the painful but ultimately liberating choice to prioritize belonging to oneself over belonging to the collective. This shift is what finally breaks the hypnotic spell of social norms and expectations. The only home that matters is the integrated, whole self. This is a subtle yet critical distinction. The individual is not leaving society because they have found a better society. They are leaving because they have found a better psychological state, a state of integration that is non-transferable and non-negotiable. They trade the false comfort of being a conforming fragment for the terrifying freedom of being a whole outsider. This trade-off is the silent engine driving the mass exodus. It is an internal movement that results in external disappearance. The psychological term for what is happening to the awakened in the collective is cognitive dissonance, amplified to an existential crisis. Cognitive dissonance is the mental stress or discomfort experienced by an individual who holds two or more contradictory beliefs, ideas, or values. For the unconscious person, this dissonance is mild and manageable. They simply rationalize or deny the contradictions in their life and in society. But for the conscious person, the gap between their internal truth, the reality of the self, and the external lie, the reality of the collective unconscious, is so vast that the resulting dissonance is physically and psychologically unbearable. Imagine walking into a room where everyone is operating on a fundamental shared delusion. Say, the belief that they must wear their shoes on their hands. You, the conscious person, see your hands are for grasping and your feet are for walking. The collective reality is illogical, inefficient, and painful to watch, but it is real to everyone else. Every time you must engage, you have two choices. Compromise. Put your shoes on your hands to fit in, sacrificing your sanity and efficiency. This is the betrayal of consciousness. Withdraw. Leave the room and use your body as it was designed. This is the necessary withdrawal. The collective unconscious is this delusional room. It operates on shared illusions of separateness, eternal conflict, and material primacy. The awakened soul knows at a profound level that unity is the fundamental reality, that conflict is mostly projected shadow, and that consciousness is primary. To then have to navigate an entire world designed to uphold the opposite is the source of the draining psychological labor. A fascinating point of divergence from the original Jungian context is the impact of accelerated communication and information overload. Jung lived in an era where the collective unconscious was slow and locally contained. Today, that unconscious has been weaponized and globalized by technology. Social media, cable news, and algorithm-driven content all act as massive real-time amplifiers of collective shadow projection. The conscious individual today isn't just dealing with the low-grade static of their local community. They are dealing with a global tsunami of unconsciousness. This intensification means that the need for withdrawal is no longer a slow, meandering journey, but an urgent psychological evacuation. The nervous system of the awakened is not designed to process this constant barrage of negative, polarized, and inauthentic material. The mysterious chronic fatigue and illnesses Jung observed in his patients are now manifesting as widespread sensory overload, burnout, and acute spiritual anxiety in those who haven't yet found a way to disappear. The body is giving the soul a clear, nonverbal command: disengage or die. The modern hermit, therefore, often starts by mastering digital boundary setting. This is the first crucial act of withdrawal. It's not just about deleting Facebook, it's about curating an entire informational diet, choosing silence over noise, and valuing internal stillness over external stimulation. They are actively seeking to create a psychological immune system that can reject the pathogens of the collective mind. The conscious disappearance is a disciplined practice of renunciation, renouncing the need for external validation, renouncing the addiction to drama, and renouncing the temptation to fix the collective before one is fully whole. It is a humble recognition that the most powerful thing one can do for the world is to stop contributing to its noise and start cultivating its necessary, profound silence. The entire journey of withdrawal and return is a process of psychic individuation that mirrors the life cycle of a tree. First, the seed, the unawakened self, is exposed to the world. Then it must send down deep roots, the withdrawal phase, grounding itself in the nutrient-rich, dark silence of the earth. Only after profound, unseen inner work can it finally begin to break the surface, the return, and offer its unique form to the light. This quiet, necessary rooting is what the collective mistakes for absence or failure. Let's focus on the deep psychological shift that occurs during the hermit phase, which is a key component created outside of the original script. This phase is not passive. It is an active, focused time of inner alchemy. The primary work is the reevaluation of core values. In the collective unconscious, values are generally extrinsic: wealth, status, recognition, power over others, and physical appearance. These are the measuring sticks of the persona. During the withdrawal, the awakened person systematically dismantles these extrinsic values and replaces them with intrinsic ones. Authenticity, psychological integrity, inner peace, self-knowledge, and service from a place of wholeness. This shift has devastating real-world consequences for the old life. For example, a person who once valued a six-figure salary, extrinsic, will now value the freedom of time to pursue deep inner work, intrinsic. The six-figure salary job, which demands 60 hours a week and persona performance, is immediately rendered obsolete and is abandoned. A relationship based on shared social status, extrinsic, is exposed as hollow when compared to the need for a connection based on shared psychological depth and truth, intrinsic. This internal realignment is the engine that drives the external disappearance. The new values act as a moral compass that points irrevocably away from the center of the unconscious society. Furthermore, the hermit phase is crucial for establishing the witness consciousness. This is the ability to observe one's own thoughts, emotions, and reactions without identification or judgment. In the collective, the ego is constantly triggered by projections, conflicts, and the need to perform, which makes sustained witness consciousness impossible. The moment you are sucked into a political argument or social drama, you lose the ability to witness. You become the thing you are arguing with. Solitude provides the safe, quiet laboratory where the individual can practice and solidify the witness function. This is critical for the eventual return. When the border dweller comes back to the edges of society, they are no longer easily triggered. They can observe the mass psychosis and the shadow projections without getting pulled into the drama. They see a political debate and can witness it as two groups violently projecting their unconscious material. Their internal work has created a psychic immunity to the contagion of collective drama. The depth of this transformation is why Jung stressed that the individuation process cannot be reversed. You cannot unlearn the witness function. You cannot unvalue intrinsic worth. The bridge back to the old unconscious life is burned precisely because the internal terrain has been completely remade. The awakened are, in essence, a new psychological species emerging from the cocoon of the collective. Their disappearance is not a loss of participants for society, but the necessary incubation of a higher capacity for individual and eventually collective awareness. The necessity of the hermit phase is further illuminated by the concept of psychological inertia. The collective unconscious is a massive force of inertia. It resists change, seeks stasis, and works actively to pull anything that deviates back into its field of gravity. For the newly conscious individual, this collective inertia feels like a powerful, invisible drag, making every step toward individuality a struggle against immense pressure. Imagine trying to launch a small rocket, your nascent consciousness, from a gigantic spinning planet, the collective unconscious. You need to reach escape velocity. The withdrawal is the act of strategically removing the launching platform from the planet's gravitational field. In solitude, the force of collective inertia dramatically decreases, allowing the individual to dedicate all their energy to internal propulsion, to the work of individuation, rather than constantly fighting the external pull. If the individual attempts to individuate while maintaining full participation in the collective, They find their precious energy is perpetually diverted. The collective will use every psychological trick to pull them back. Guilt, fear of isolation, appeals to loyalty, and the promise of acceptance. These are the tools of inertia, designed to enforce conformity. The successful withdrawal is the courageous moment where the individual chooses psychic freedom over social convenience. Let's consider the effect of this withdrawal on the creative function of the psyche. The most profound creative acts, the writing of great books, the composition of enduring music, the formulation of revolutionary philosophical or scientific ideas, almost universally require sustained periods of isolation. Creativity and performance are often mutually exclusive. Performance is about replicating what is known and acceptable. Creativity is about birthing what is utterly new and often initially unacceptable to the collective. The fully individuated person's ultimate contribution is always a creative one. They create a new way of being, a new relationship to life, and a new paradigm of truth. This creation demands the deep, uninterrupted silence of the hermit phase. The artist or writer who returns to the margins does so because their true work, the work of consciousness, cannot be diluted by the noise of the marketplace. They are returning to offer their creation, not to sell their persona. The collective often views solitude as deprivation, a form of punishment or a sign of depression. But the awakened person knows solitude is psychological nourishment. It is in the deep quiet that the fragments of the self, the persona, the shadow, the ego, the anima, animus, can finally settle and be seen in relation to the self. This is the process of integration that is interrupted by every knock on the door, every text message, and every social expectation. Therefore, the duration of the hermit phase is dictated not by a calendar but by the completion of this alchemical work. It lasts until the new internal structure, the individuated self, is so robust, so firmly rooted in intrinsic values, and so competent in the witness consciousness that it can finally re-engage with the world from a position of impregnable strength rather than vulnerable compromise. It lasts until the individual is no longer pulled by the world, but can choose to approach it with a gift. The phenomenon of the awakened disappearing is also a profound sociological commentary on the state of modern community. True community, from a psychological perspective, must be able to hold and support the individual's full complexity, including their emergent consciousness. Modern society, however, has largely replaced authentic community with collective conformity and a transactional form of belonging. In a truly conscious community, the individuation process would be celebrated, and periods of withdrawal would be understood and respected as necessary stages of growth. But in the collective unconscious, difference is feared and wholeness is threatening. When an individual achieves wholeness, they stop being predictable. They stop being easily manipulated by collective anxieties or consumer desires. They become a source of instability in a system that prizes stability above all else. This explains why one of the most painful aspects of the withdrawal is the severing of old relationships. These relationships were often built on the premise of mutual unconsciousness. Two people bonded by their shared persona performance and shared shadow projections. When one partner awakens and the persona dies, the foundation of the relationship crumbles. The awakened person can no longer participate in the unconscious games that once held the bond together. They cannot sustain relationships that required them to be false. The unawakened partner often perceives this change as betrayal, not as evolution. They feel abandoned because the person they knew, the persona, is genuinely gone. The awakened must accept that their commitment to their own inner truth supersedes their commitment to maintaining the illusion of the old relationship. The pain is real, but the sacrifice is necessary for the integrity of the self. The natural consequence of this severing is the search for the conscious pocket, or the small conscious community upon returning. These emerging communities are not based on geography, ideology, or social status. They are based on a shared frequency of consciousness and a mutual commitment to authenticity. They are the true border dweller spaces, groups of people who understand the language of the self and who actively choose not to project their shadows onto one another. In these conscious pockets, psychological labor becomes restorative rather than draining. Because the members are operating from a place of authenticity, energy is spent on creating and contributing truth, rather than constantly defending one's truth against unconscious assault. These pockets are the architectural blueprints for a future, more conscious society. They are the proof that genuine human connection is possible outside the confines of the collective unconscious. It's a powerful statement. The awakened individual, upon return, doesn't seek to change the collective masses. They seek to find their tribe, the small group of people who are also too conscious for the container. This selective re-engagement is the ultimate act of self-preservation and the most effective way to offer their gifts without being consumed. The return of the border dwellers is an act of courageous vulnerability. After the deep solitude of the hermit phase, the psyche is extremely sensitive and raw. Re-engaging with the world, even on the margins, means exposing the authentic self to potential harm. However, this time, the individual returns armed with the wisdom that vulnerability is not weakness. It is the source of genuine connection. The persona's armor is permanently discarded. The key difference in the return is the shift in motivation, which is entirely created outside the original script, but is a necessary component of the individuated life. The border dweller is motivated by service born of surplus, not obligation born of lack. Before withdrawal, the individual might have tried to help the collective out of guilt, or a desperate need for validation, or a messianic complex. This effort was always draining because it came from a place of lack, a lack of self-worth, a lack of wholeness. The energy was spent trying to fill a hole in themselves by fixing the world. After the hermit phase, the individual's cup is full. They have integrated their shadow, solidified their self, and established a sustainable internal source of energy. Their motivation for service, for becoming the artist, the healer, or the guide, is now purely an overflow of this inner abundance. They give because they are so full, not because they are so empty. This is the only way to give without being consumed. Consider the wisdom they return with. It is a wisdom that has been tested in the forge of their own depths. It is not borrowed from a book, not a spiritual platitude, but a lived existential truth. This wisdom is what Jung called gestating wisdom. It is profound, hard-won, and often simple. It's the truth that comes from staring into the void and finding the self staring back. This depth is what the world truly needs, yet it can only be delivered in small, potent doses. The border dweller knows that the collective can only handle a trickle of this truth, not a fire hose. They speak in parables, they create resonant art, they work with one soul at a time. Their impact is not measured by the size of their audience, but by the depth of transformation they ignite in others. The awakened who return are essentially midwives of consciousness. They do not force awakening. They simply hold the space for another person's necessary withdrawal or transformation to begin. They become the person who can say, "Yes, I know that terrifying feeling of being too conscious for the collective container. I walked that path. Here is a map." This quiet presence is the most powerful form of service, making their limited presence on the margins far more impactful than their full, compromised participation in the center would ever have been. The successful integration of the hermit phase gives rise to a particular psychological skill set essential for the border dweller: psychological self-sovereignty. This skill is the absolute, non-negotiable ownership of one's inner state. immune to external manipulation. Psychological self-sovereignty is the conscious refusal to let one's happiness, peace, or sense of self-worth be determined by the collective's opinions, judgments, or acceptance. It is the final, permanent rejection of the external validation system that fuels the entire collective unconscious. The awakened person now validates themselves from the deep, reliable well of the self. This manifests in several critical ways. The border dweller does not seek to convert. They do not argue, debate, or attempt to force their consciousness onto the unawakened. They know that awakening is an internal, non-transferable event. Their presence is an invitation, not a recruitment drive. Is immune to blame. Because they have integrated their personal shadow, they are no longer easily caught by the collective's shadow projections, which are always built on blame and scapegoating. They see the projection, not the target. Masters the art of non-reaction. They can watch the collective drama unfold with a profound sense of psychological detachment, knowing the drama is the collective's way of avoiding internal work. Their energy remains sovereign. This state of sovereignty creates the most valuable gift they bring back, a field of non-anxious presence. When the world is operating in a state of mass anxiety and projection, the border dweller provides a small, stable anchor of calm. Simply being in the presence of someone who is psychologically sovereign can be profoundly regulating for another person's nervous system. This is often the true healing power of the modern conscious therapist, teacher, or guide. They offer their state of being, not just their knowledge. The return to the conscious edges is not a political act. It is an ontological statement. It is a public yet quiet declaration that a different reality is possible. The parallel structures the border dwellers build, the conscious communities, the small group workshops, the intentional art projects, are living evidence that life can be centered on authenticity, integrity, and depth, rather than performance and consumption. These small, conscious enclaves become centers of gravity for the next wave of seekers. When a person in the mainstream begins to feel the first agonizing pull of withdrawal, they often look around and see no viable alternative. The border dwellers provide that alternative. They are the living proof that one can leave the collective and not only survive, but thrive in a more conscious, truthful way. They have, as Jung predicted, created spaces for others to disappear to. They are the cartographers of the inner world, offering maps that were drawn in their own solitude. In conclusion, the mass exodus of spiritually awake people from society is the most underreported evolutionary event of our time. It is the inevitable byproduct of an individual achieving individuation, a psychological process that makes continued participation in the collective unconscious unbearable. The reasons for this withdrawal are non-negotiable: the intolerable agony of the collective shadow, the psychological impossibility of persona performance, and the sheer unsustainability of maintaining consciousness against a tsunami of unconsciousness. The withdrawal is not a failure of character, but an archetypal necessity, the hermit phase, which is a period of vital integration and the gestation of wisdom. The awakened are not abandoning the collective. They are preparing a profound gift for it. They are becoming aquarium fish, adapted to depths that society cannot yet reach, developing the consciousness that will be required for the next stage of human development. Their eventual return is characterized by their new role as border dwellers. They return to the conscious margins, equipped with a self-sovereignty that allows them to serve from a place of surplus rather than being consumed by obligation. They become the artists, healers, and guides who build the parallel structures, the islands of authenticity that offer a lifeline to the next wave of individuating souls. This is the great quiet movement of our time. It is a necessary separation that precedes a conscious, future re-engagement. If you feel the pull to disappear, you are not flawed, you are pioneering, you are not weak, you are simply realizing that consciousness requires different conditions than sleep. Give yourself the sacred permission to withdraw consciously, to integrate with purpose, and to return transformed, carrying the gifts that only your solitude could create. The collective needs your depth, your authenticity, and your evolved consciousness far more than it needs your conformity.